Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. We're going on a trip up north, clear up into Douglas County, which is home for my guests. I want to welcome back the Kruses. Thanks for coming down.
Thank you for having us.
I've learned a little bit about the Kruses. Anybody that's been in Douglas County hears that name. How many Kruses have lived in, do you have any idea?
I would imagine 50 to 100, but not a good count. Judging from what and of course, as the girls would marry, they assumed a different name, but
Sure.
They're still just as much kin. What the count would be, I don't know, but judging from the gatherings at our old family reunions, maybe 50 to 100.
Now, where do you have your reunions and when?
Every 2 years now.
Okay, in Roseburg or out
Roseburg area,
there?
usually at a cousin's house, maybe at a Grange Hall.
Out the Grange Hall. Doesn't that sound neat? I mean, you meet at the Grange for all sorts of things. We went for Sunday breakfast, pancake breakfast at the Grange this year. You meet such neat people out there. But now, your family roots, let's just go back. They go into Douglas County when?
1876.
When somebody came on a horse and buggy or wagon? Or
It would have been by boat to Oregon.
by boat to Oregon.
First of all to San Francisco, then I believe probably to Coos Bay, and then horse or wagon, and of course you could boat up the Umpqua River quite a ways at the time to above Scottsburg. Just how the trip was made, we don't know, but not a paved road.
Oh, we sure wish they'd have kept one of those careful journals. Wouldn't you love
Yes.
to open that? Well, now you went from, because that's talking great-grandpa,
Yes.
and he was this builder, right?
Yes.
He built homes all over Douglas County.
The best we know, the old family history was shipbuilders. Cruises in the Portland area, cruises in the Coos Bay area in the early part of the 1900s were shipbuilders. Most of the bigger ships or boats built in the Coos Bay area were cruises, and most of the cruises came to this country about the same time, and we'd heard that there was shipbuilding in the family, so we're just assuming before he took up ranching in Douglas County and then retired to home building that putting things together out of wood were part of his old heritage. So houses are a little drier than a boat. But
Yes, indeed. Well, now the cruises came from Germany,
Germany.
so the industry of these people being work, like you could hardly get him on TV. I guess this is the second year I've said, why don't you come down and tell us your story? Well, logging's pretty good right now.
It's busy.
Can't take the time off. I think I pestered him to the extent that here you are, all the way from Glide. You live in rural Glide?
No, we live in the boondocks, Roseburg Glide area.
Okay.
We don't claim Glide. Our mailing address is Roseburg, and that's the center of our activity. But we're just about midway and off the beaten path.
Yeah, well, we live in Merlin, but we have a Grants Pass address, and we're really a mile off the pavement. So it's let's talk military. This guy's a sailor.
He is. First World War, 1918.
Who is he?
That's my father.
And your father had how many children?
He just had 4 of us.
Just 4. And the baby is sitting here right
Yes.
now.
3 big sisters, and that's really tough.
Oh, yes, I bet it is. Well, you went in the military also. You were drafted?
I was drafted.
World War?
The height of the Vietnam War.
So you've got stories about, I want to honor the Vietnam vets who had it so tough. Your job was not in Vietnam, though.
I never made it to Vietnam.
Because you had a special assignment?
Yes, I did, and it was voluntary. Just to go back a little bit, I remember as a young child, a lot of the young guys were coming back from Korean conflict. And I assumed that when I got to be a few years older that I would be drafted like everyone else I knew when they got to that age.
Sure.
And they'd give you a gun, and because a group of politicians put their heads together, they would say, go shoot the enemy. And I remember as a young child, I decided I would not be willing to shoot the enemy because the politicians had declared a war. Though I appreciated the idea of homeland security, I had to have a better reason than just someone saying, let's make war. And I decided at a young age when they handed me the gun and said shoot, that I would shoot at the ground or a rock or a tree, unless I saw a real good purpose for the shooting. And I was still fairly young when I heard the story of Desmond Doss.
Aha, the movie.
And learned that he went in as a non-combatant. And I knew not long after that you could be what was called a conscientious objector. Generally, they'd assign you to a hospital, some other civilian type duty someplace.
Or maybe like Desmond Doss.
Well, he went very, very active military. He was drafted.
Right, and he was right out in the field bringing those wounded people. I mean, he's received the national highest honor.
Congressional Medal of Honor.
And he never carried
He's
a gun?
never touched a gun. As a medic, and saved many lives. And I thought, well, that sounds like a lot better duty.
Yeah, and now that's been made into a movie and given very high acclaim.
Just recently, a good documentary on Desmond Doss.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. So what did you choose, or did it choose you when you said, I'll be a non-com?
It was a little bit of both. I signed up as a non-combatant. At the time, and all the non-combatants in the Army would automatically go to Fort Sam Houston, Texas for medic training.
Sure.
About a little over 18 weeks of fairly intensive training.
Sure.
And they teach you to do things that you wouldn't want someone that had only 18 weeks of training to do to you. But when you have a hole blown in you, a limb missing or something out in the battlefield, you're probably willing for any kind of help that comes along.
Right. I heard in the Desmond Doss story he grabbed somebody's gun and splinted his own self and went right on working.
Yes, he did.
That's the one you see ad found for a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So where did it take you?
Well, it took me to Fort Sam Houston for medic training I was there actually, they told me the largest class that had ever gone through Fort Sam Houston. But twice a year, there would come an interview to Fort Sam Houston for recruits for Project White Coat.
Okay.
There were some qualifications to that. The main one at the time was you had to be a Seventh-day Adventist. They had their reasons. Many of them had spent their time in a boarding school. And because of the projects involved, it was good that they knew how to live on a ward, close proximity with others. They also had a fairly stable health background because of a healthy lifestyle. They were good subjects. The actual service was to be a human guinea pig. You were a test subject. This was all voluntary. Each project was voluntary. It was voluntary to become a white coat.
Okay.
You could say, nay, I don't want to be a white coat, and you would not be a white coat. You could say, yes, I do want to be a white coat. And they would look at some of your aptitude scores, your work background, so forth and so on, and see if you fit the program.
If you qualified. Now, I know Mervyn Lewis here in Grants Pass went in as a white coat. And some of the things that you tested, is that the right word?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say they vaccinated you for something that they weren't sure was going to work. How about you? Did you survive all those tests?
I lived through it, yes. And not all those tests. Most of the white coats would have one project only. And some of them were as simple as testing a vaccine. That's what my project was, 2 different strains of encephalitis vaccine.
So you didn't know if you were getting the real thing?
They were commonly used, both of them, in an Eastern and a Western encephalitis vaccine. If you were vaccinated for them, they would give you a shot, and a few seconds later give you the other one.
The real thing?
The real thing. All they would do on the test that I had was combine 2 of them into 1 syringe. Very, very low key. We saw no hazard at all to it. Just to verify that giving them both together was no different than giving them separately. Most of the subjects were given a disease, and there was quite a variety of them. At the time, almost anything that the troops were commonly getting in Vietnam was tested. Many of them had flu-like symptoms, and you would get sick. High fever, nauseated, very ill. You would be locked onto a ward for 30 days with usually 12 to 15 other test subjects.
So you got well acquainted. Now, what were you doing during this time?
Well, at that time we were dating, and actually whether he got in the white coats or went to Vietnam we had decided would mean whether we got married or not. So we were waiting to see if he got in the white coats, because we had decided that if he went to Vietnam that we should wait to get married until he got back. But he went into the white coats, and so we ended up getting married.
And spending your honeymoon?
Yes, driving across the United States so that he could be there to report for duty 4 days after we got married.
Oh my.
The safe return ratio for medics in Vietnam was very poor at that time. I remember an early class at basic training as a non-combatant, learning to be a medic, probably headed for Vietnam. And I remember the instructor standing up and asking several questions. How many of you got your non-combatant status for religious or moral conviction purposes about shooting someone just because there's a political war? And there are 2 different categories he asked in that, and about a third in each one raised their hands that this is why I became a non-combatant, because of religious or moral convictions. The third question he asked was, how many of you got your non-combatant status because you thought it was going to keep you out of the action? And most of the other third raised their hand on that one.
He said?
Then he read the statistics. He said, you are most likely going to be field medics in Vietnam. And the mortality rate is much higher than either infantry or artillery for field medics.
Are you sure you want to go this
And
way?
some of these guys cried big tears right there in that class, because they got their non-combatant status because they thought this is safe duty, and they found out it was one of the most dangerous spots to be in the war.
I want to connect with your own family, because I love this picture so much. It looks like this is who? This is your grandmother?
In the front center is my great-grandmother.
Okay. And this is their family home?
That is a home, a house that her husband, my great-grandfather William Henry Kruse, built on South Pine Street in Roseburg. That house is still standing, looks very much like that today.
And I just figure these young women are kitchen help, but you said that this is part of your family too.
There's a couple of them in there that are part of the family, her daughters.
So she'd say, now girls, you put on the aprons and you serve the table, and then come out through the kitchen door and we'll get our portrait taken. You brought a picture that's so hard to see.
Fairly weathered. That photograph would be about 110 years old, 100 years old anyway.
And this is from Roseburg?
Kruse Newland Grocery Store, right downtown in the old part of Roseburg on Jackson Street.
And this is from the historic...
That's a museum photo, a different photo of the same place at a different time.
You know I want to ask you about downtown Roseburg. Something terrible happened to downtown Roseburg, and it stopped existing. One morning? Why don't you tell us what happened?
Was it August 7, I believe, 1959? hardware store in town. Also was involved in transporting and selling explosives, and a truck parked there overnight related to the business. The store caught on fire, and the truck got hot enough that it ignited and it blew up, I think about 7 tons of dynamite and other, explosive fertilizer.
Yeah, it was fertilizer as well.
Yeah.
And what happened to Roseburg?
Well, a fair portion of it disappeared. It kind of evaporated. The part where great-grandpa or grandpa's store was got shaken badly. Most of the windows were gone, but it was fairly protected by a continuous line of buildings. But in the blast area, you've seen pictures of where a bomb has hit a city. This one had been bombed. There were train tracks that looked like pretzels. There were train cars that looked like scrap iron. There were buildings that had disappeared.
And people were gone.
Total, I think the death toll ended up around 13.
Now, where were you when this happened?
On a farm about 5 miles to the west.
Okay, what happened that morning at your house?
Well, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I believe, when it blew. We had some cots, and I think one of my sisters were sleeping outside in the backyard. I can distinctly remember, as I went to sleep that night, hearing the corn grow. Now, if you've been outside at night in the middle of a cornfield when it's vigorously growing, you hear it grow. If you can remember picking an ear of corn, it squeaks and pops as you slide, as things tear and slide apart. The stalk, the segments in the stalk are slipping one in another, and you hear this continuous squeaking, popping sound on a good growing night. So that's how you hear corn grow.
I didn't know that.
I remember that night as I went to sleep, and my dad was up, and I don't know whether he was still up from the previous day or had gotten up to start the next day, but during harvest time, it was nearly 24 hours a day. And I believe he was
24/6, right?
Yeah, I believe he was packing tomatoes
Okay.
with a light outside, actually out in the orchard, I think, or maybe in the packing shed when it blew. And he heard the noise and saw from 5 miles away, saw a mushroom cloud. And of course there was fire in the cloud, there was fire under it, the smoke and debris that went up from the blast site. And the Cold War was kind of brewing at that time. And he thought, well, probably the Russians have dropped a bomb on us.
Mushroom cloud.
Why they started in Roseburg, why I didn't hear it in yesterday's news, and why they didn't hit Los Angeles and New York City first. But what else would you imagine when you see a mushroom cloud going up in the area of Roseburg several miles away?
And the earth shook?
He heard the noise. I don't think there was a shaking there. I heard the noise, I woke up, and by the time I was well awake, the noise was gone, and I went back to sleep and didn't know about it until daylight. And my dad was concerned that maybe a war had started. Turned on local radio station and nothing. Well, the bomb took the radio station out. So he tuned in to other radio stations, and finally about daylight he got one out of Northern California that explained what had happened, that it was a truck that had blown up. And I remember touring it the next day, and it was a mess.
Disaster.
Yes.
Disaster. I'm sure that there are stories about it. Now, this was before your time, or were you in Roseburg at the time?
I was living in the Myrtle Creek area, and I just remember afterwards driving to Roseburg and seeing where the junior high had been and the destruction that had happened to it.
Block after block after block.
Yeah.
And Old Town, right? Gone. Gone in just a moment. Speaking of gone
Middle of the night, and that really protected a lot of people because it was in the business district.
Oh,
And there was very little activity going on at 1 o'clock in the morning. A few pedestrians, a few cars going by, and of course some firemen that were right in the middle of it when it happened.
Oh, sure, because they were fighting
They
the
were doing their
store
job.
fire. Oh, you brought this picture of early history. And this kind of ties in with my friends, because this is a school picture from where? Douglas County.
No, that's a little ways north of Douglas County. That's up in the Cottage Grove area, just north of us.
And
That's a Christian boarding school. They also had day school there. My
Okay.
father attended there
your dad.
1911, 12, 13, along in there as a boarding student in high school.
Well, my friend Audrey Christie Highland went to this boarding school, and I'd never seen a picture of it. So kids would come from some distance and it was way out in the country, or?
It was, there was a little settlement out there, and there's still, it's fairly rural even today. There's no sign of the school left.
Well, the whole Douglas County, I've been so fortunate to go to your museum in Canyonville, you know, where they brought in these buildings that other people didn't want, I guess. And you can go, I hope you'll stop in Canyonville and look at that museum. They are so gracious. These two pictures, do you know who, what, when?
Well, this is my father and a friend, and he shows up in the other pictures.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that. There's so much history. Your family name is very, very well known. There's Kruse this and Kruse that, and I don't mean car cruises, and I don't mean, but what is the famous Kruse connection? Is it the dirt?
There seems to be a tendency toward the dirt, and I think there's a gluttony for hard work.
Okay. So you work with the trees that grow in the dirt. Your cousin works with?
Row crops, fruit stand.
Row crops. That means right out of the garden to the fruit stand to your table.
And it's as labor intensive as anything you can do. It's
And
intimidating to think about planting millions of seeds and harvesting several fruits or more from each seed.
So his name and where he is?
Well, that's Don Kruse, and he is in the Roseburg area.
If I wanted to find his place, I'd go out.
You would go to the fruit stand, I suppose.
You'd go out Garden Valley.
Garden Valley to the Y.
Melrose Road.
And right there, what besides fruit? I mean, your family sold melons, I know that.
This was previous. This was 50 years ago. We left the first Kruse fruit stand, which was in closer to town.
Okay.
We grew everything we sold, and it was all in season. When the first early apples or first early crops were ready, the fruit stand would open with maybe a few bushel of apple, and then as the melons and tomatoes and berries and cucumbers came, we would expand the inventory. But
Right.
they import some, so they open longer than the local growing season.
And they also bake. Ooh,
Bakery,
do they
yes.
bake?
Yeah, they're actually open now, I believe. I think they open like around the 1st of April and go through to the end of January. So there's just a few months out of the year they're not open.
And they're probably planning all of them.
If you go into the bakery, on the wall of the bakery is a little colored wall banner. It's in a frame now that actually came from this grocery store. It's
Really?
preserved well.
So your family stayed in the business of hands-on kind of stuff. What about, do you grow your own? Do you have a garden? Are you people into
We're kind of out of the growing zone. We're up in the hills. Different climate up there. So we have a small garden at times.
You mean snow and that sort of?
There is that. We had snow a few days ago here in April.
We're filming in April.
We have had several inches of snow in early October.
What's it like to live, are you at the end of the road? Or?
We are.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I know people have said, oh, don't you get scared out here? And it doesn't bother me. I'd be more fearful if I lived in town, I think. But I love where we live. We live in a beautiful spot, and I can go out and walk, and listen to the birds and look at the wildflowers, and it's just a beautiful.
Now, did you build your own place?
No, we live in a house.
We live in
that's
an old cabin.
about 100 years old. Just I
No
always
pictures of your.
no, and I always tell people it's an old farmhouse, but it's a poor person's farmhouse. It's not one of these elegant, fancy ones. It's very simple.
Not like Grandpa
No,
built
Right.
with
no,
the
no.
fancy work.
But the interesting thing is that, you know, Lynden talked about his family has been builders. He also likes to build things, and he has a sawmill so he can make his own lumber. And several years ago, he totally tore off our kitchen, which was about falling off of the house anyway, and rebuilt it from the ground up, and then built a room above for me to, he calls it my playhouse, where I sew and have my computer. And
Computer in a 100-year-old house. Doesn't that boggle your mind?
And he cut down the oak trees and made the lumber that made the cabinets. That we have oak cabinets in the new kitchen that he built.
So it's an old cabin with a fancy new kitchen.
Yeah.
Well, good for you. When you're not building kitchens and you just can't log all year long, can you?
Oh, no.
Because?
Well, mud, the kind of logging I do, you miss the muddy season for the most part.
Right. And you miss the white fly season or the too dry to log.
Sometimes that restricts us.
And so besides logging and all this truck farming, what's kept you in Southern Oregon for all your life, right?
It's a place to call home, and it's
Oh.
I've come and gone. I've been other places, and I tend to come back for a reason.
It's a place to call home. The whole state of Jefferson. Just imagine this little hollow of God's hand goes from the mountains in the eastern Oregon Klamath area to the coast. Well, we call it home, and I think we're the luckiest people in the whole wide world.
I think so too.
Thank you so much for coming our way, being on Journeys and Journals. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you.
I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying thanks so much for tuning in. We love to hear stories about a century and more in our area with the Kruse family today. Thanks for being our guests.